The little girl disappeared in her house 2 years later. The repairman discovered a horrifying secret behind the wall. For nearly 2 years, no one could explain how 12-year-old Emily Whitman vanished without a trace from her own home in suburban Oregon. Her mother was working the night shift. The house was locked. The alarms were untouched. Detectives found no leads, no witnesses, just a silent hallway and a missing girl. Then one morning during routine repairs, a contractor pressed his hand against the wall of a storage room and felt a strange draft. What they discovered behind that wall would unravel a twisted secret buried just inches from where Grace had searched, cried, and prayed every day. This is a story of a mother's relentless hope, a child's hidden world, and the neighbor no one ever suspected. You won't believe what was behind that wall. The morning began in quiet. A soft fog clung to the edges of the street, blurring the faded picket fences and silent maple trees just beginning to bronze. Grace Carter parked her old Volvo in front of the house, fingers white around the steering wheel. The night shift had been long and unforgiving, the hospital understaffed again. All she wanted now was coffee, a hot shower, and her daughter's sleepy voice echoing down the stairs. She unlocked the door, stepped into the stillness of their modest two-story home, and dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the entry. The air smelled faintly of lavender, Emily's pillow spray. Grace managed a tired smile. Maybe Emily had remembered to brush her teeth before bed. Maybe she hadn't stayed up reading under the covers again. She padded quietly up the stairs, still in scrubs, her sneakers damp from the morning dew. Emily's door was half closed as usual. Grace pushed it open gently. The room was bathed in a pale gray light filtering through gauzy curtains. The unicorn night lamp still glowed softly in the corner, forgotten. The bed was empty. Grace blinked, stepping forward, half expecting to see her daughter crouched behind the bed, playing a prank. But the room was silent. No giggle, no rustle, just silence. Emily, she called, her voice catching. No answer. She checked the ensuite bathroom. Empty. She opened the closet. Nothing but a row of little cardigans and colorful sneakers. Panic started to crawl up her spine. She raced downstairs, checked the kitchen, the laundry room, the backyard. Nothing. Back upstairs, she scanned the room again, really looked. The pink comforter was slightly ruffled. Emily's favorite bumblebee socks lay on the floor twisted. Her plush rabbit lay under the bed, half covered in dust, as if it had been dropped suddenly. But the windows were locked from the inside. The front door was still chained when Grace entered. There was no sign of a break-in. No furniture moved, no open window, no sound. It was like Emily had simply disappeared. Grace dialed 911 with shaking hands. By the time the police arrived, the neighborhood was awake. Patrol cars flanked the quiet cul-de-sac. Officer Rowan, a calm middle-aged man with thoughtful eyes, led the search. They combed every room, inspected. The locks questioned Grace repeatedly. There's no broken glass, no forced entry, Rowan said softly. Are you absolutely sure she was home last night? I tucked her in at 8:30. Grace whispered, her hands trembling. I kissed her goodnight. She had a nightmare the night before I stayed until she fell asleep. They searched the surrounding area for days. Dogs picked up no scent beyond the front steps. Helicopters scanned the woods outside of Willow Bend. No ransom note ever came. No witnesses, no evidence. It was as if Emily Carter had been erased. 2 weeks passed. The media attention swallowed in blood. Strangers on the internet blamed Grace. They questioned her routine, her single mother stories, her night shifts. Her face was plastered across headlines. 8-year-old girl vanishes in her sleep. But behind every brutal headline, behind every reporter's mic, Grace sat in her daughter's untouched bedroom at night listening, hoping. On Emily's 9th birthday, Grace made her a chocolate cupcake, lit a candle, and placed it beside her photo. The candle flickered for exactly 8 minutes before dying. That night, Grace stopped praying. 2 years later, the case had gone cold. Willow Bend had moved on, but the house had not. It was on a rainy Thursday morning, when the leaves had started to clog the gutters again, that Grace finally allowed someone else back inside. Jim Harper, a local handyman she'd trusted for years, arrived with a thermos of coffee and his usual quiet, meticulous tools. Grace had asked him to check the flooring in the back storage room. It had begun to warp from moisture, and she wanted to seal it before winter came. As Jim knelt near the base of the wall, prying off a loose wooden panel, he paused, then frowned. "Grace," he called from the other room. "You mind stepping in here for a sec?" She walked in, arms folded against the cold draft, still holding her mug. "Everything all right?" Jim was crouched low, examining a seam where the paneling met the floor. "There's a draft here. Feel that?" She leaned down, confused. A light breeze brushed against her fingers, cold and unexpected. "That shouldn't be possible," she said, voice low. "That wall backs into the foundation. There's no crawl space." Jim scratched his chin. "Well, there's air coming from somewhere. And this section sounds hollow." He tapped it. A faint, muffled echo returned. Grace stared at the wall. Her throat tightened. Jim glanced up at her. "Mind if I open this up a bit more?" Her lips parted. She hesitated, then nodded. He worked slowly, carefully. Each nail pulled free echoed louder than the last. Dust spilled from behind the slats. As he peeled away a final panel, the air in the room seemed to shift, cooler, heavier. Behind the wooden wall was a layer of dark sheetrock, and behind that, silence. Jim pressed his ear to the flat surface. His eyes narrowed. He didn't speak for a moment. "I think," he murmured, "there's something back there." Grace took a step back instinctively. Her heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a sensation she hadn't dared to feel in years. A whisper of hope. She didn't yet know what was behind that wall, but something was, and it was waiting. Part 2. The next morning, Grace stood barefoot on the hardwood floor of the storage room, arms folded tightly across her chest. The wooden panel that once covered the wall now leaned against the far corner, exposing a narrow vertical crack in the dark sheetrock. Jim arrived early, toolbox in hand, eyes as serious as they had been the night before. Neither of them said much. Words seemed unnecessary now. Grace had spent most of the night pacing. She hadn't slept. Her mind spun between dread and longing, between logic and something far more fragile, hope. "I'll cut clean," Jim said gently, already kneeling. "We'll go slow in case, well, just in case." She nodded. Her hands trembled slightly. Her back pressed against the doorframe, like part of her body wanted to run, while the rest stayed rooted. The saw blade pierced the wall with a low, controlled hum. Dust curled into the air. Piece by piece, Jim carved a neat rectangle about 4 feet high, 3 feet wide. When he reached the final edge, he looked up at Grace once more. "You ready?" She couldn't speak. She just nodded. Jim pressed both hands to the cut sheetrock and eased it backward. It fell into the darkness with a dull, padded thud. And behind it, nothing. At least at first. But then the light from the hallway spilled inside, and Grace gasped. There was a space, a small enclosed room no more than 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. The walls were lined with thick, soundproofing foam. On the floor was a thin mattress with a faded My Little Pony bedsheet. Beside it, a cracked plastic lamp with a dim pink bulb still faintly glowing. A folded blanket, a water bottle, a stack of children's books. It was a room for a child, and it had been hidden behind her wall for 2 years. Jim swore under his breath, backing away instinctively, but Grace was already moving. She crouched low, half crawling through the opening. Her body fit just barely. The air inside was stale metallic. Her eyes burned as they adjusted to the gloom. The smell hit her next. Not rot, not filth, but something worse, something preserved, controlled, sanitized, like someone had kept this space tidy. This had been used. And then she saw its scratches along the far foam wall. Childlike, erratic lines, some crossed out, others fresh, tiny marks, tallies, 30, 60, hundreds, days. And in the far right corner, faint but still visible, was a name scratched with a pink crayon. Emily was here. Grace's breath caught. A sob escaped before she could stop it. "Emily," she whispered, knees buckling. "Oh my God, Emily!" Jim climbed in behind her, flashlight in hand. His face had gone pale. "Grace," he said, voice rough. "Look." She followed his beam of light across the floor to the far edge of the foam paneling, where it met a low square vent. A metal grate, barely a foot wide. "A ventilation tunnel," Grace asked. "Maybe. Too small for an adult. But a kid." Jim shone the light inside. The shaft stretched forward into darkness. "Where does it lead?" she asked. He looked up at her grimly. Maybe your basement, or someone else's. Grace scrambled backward out of the hidden room, adrenaline taking over. She didn't wait for Jim. She ran through the hallway, down the stairs, through the kitchen, past the laundry room, and yanked open the basement door. The air was damp and cold. The smell of concrete and old paint hit her like a wall. She flicked the light on. Nothing. But then on the far side, near the old storage shelf that hadn't been touched in years, there was a thin metal grate along the wall, identical in size to the one upstairs. Grace approached it slowly, every inch of her skin prickling. She knelt, grabbed the edge, and pulled. It popped off with a soft groan of metal. Behind it was a dark crawl space, and wedged just inside, unmistakable, despite the dust, was a crumpled sheet of lined notebook paper. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. Written in shaky handwriting, "If you find this, I'm still here. Please don't tell him. He says Mom doesn't want me, but I know she does. I know she loves me." Signed, Emily. Grace collapsed to her knees. Emily had been alive, in this house, in the walls, for months. Maybe even now. "I'm going to find you," she whispered aloud, eyes wet. "No matter what he told you, I never stopped looking." Jim appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Grace, you need to see this." She followed him outside. The back of the house, where a low shed stood near the tree line once used for garden tools and scrap lumber. The lock was new. "I didn't change that," she said. Jim already had his crowbar in hand. It only took 2 good Prias before the latch snapped. The door creaked open, and inside was a narrow wooden stairwell descending into a subcellar. Neither of them remembered ever being there. The air that wafted up was cold and unmistakably human. Part 3. The rain came down in steady whispers that morning, soft enough to be ignored, but constant enough to make the world feel grayer than it already was. Grace stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching the first police cruiser pull into the driveway. Her heart pounded so loud she barely registered the tires crunching against the gravel or the low voices of officers stepping out in full gear. Detective Rowan approached her with a look that was both grim and careful. He was used to families hoping for too much. But this time, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. "You said the crawl space led here?" he asked, nodding toward the basement entrance. Grace nodded. Her voice was hoarse. "We found a paper in Emily's handwriting. She's still here somewhere. I can feel it." The crawl space vent had already been removed. Jim Harper stood nearby with his crowbar still in hand, eyes fixed on the ground, like he couldn't trust himself to look at Grace. Rowan turned to his team. "Thermal scanners, fiber scopes, sound sensors. Let's move." Within minutes, the house buzzed with quiet intensity. Equipment was wheeled in. Thin cables threaded through the crawl space. A handheld scanner lit up faintly with blotches of green and orange. "Heat signature. Still active," one technician muttered. "Not large, but consistent. About the size of a small child." Grace's knees buckled. Jim caught her arm just in time. "They're not ghosts," Rowan said, stepping toward her. "You may want to sit down." But she didn't. She couldn't. Not until she saw it with her own eyes. The back wall of the basement, directly behind the old storage shelves, was examined for structural irregularities. The grain of the wood was newer than the rest of the paneling. One of the officers knocked gently and got a hollow sound in return. Rowan narrowed his eyes. "This isn't foundation, it's a false wall." They began to cut. Grace watched, hands trembling at her sides as the saw blades buzzed and splinters flew. Time no longer moved in minutes or seconds, but in breaths, hers shallow, the room around her, silent but for the grinding metal. The final piece fell away with a dull, echoing clunk, and behind it was a door, small, wooden, with a child's pink sticker faintly peeling off the corner. A second later, a metallic latch creaked open, a soft push, and then light. Dim, flickering pink light from a cheap plug-in nightlight. The officers stepped back, and Grace surged forward before anyone could stop her. What she saw inside was something no mother should ever have to see, yet everything she had longed for. A narrow, soundproofed room no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were padded with foam, now dirty and torn in places. A small mattress lay in the corner, with a faded My Little Pony sheet. A chipped plastic bookshelf held worn children's books. A bucket, a blanket, 2 empty water bottles. And curled up on that mattress was a little girl, thin, pale, her legs drawn tightly to her chest, arms around her knees. Her hair, once golden and wild, was now dull and matted. Her eyes, impossibly large, fluttered open at the sound of the door. Emily. Grace couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. All she could do was step inside, hands shaking. "Emily," she whispered. The girl's eyes focused slowly. She didn't move at first, didn't smile, didn't cry. She just stared, like someone watching a dream materialize in front of her. Then softly her lips parted. "He said you left me." The words hit Grace like a bullet. Emily's voice was raspy, unused, barely a whisper but clear, measured, almost rehearsed. "He said you didn't want me anymore." But I didn't believe him. Grace dropped to her knees, her voice breaking. "No, baby, no. I never left you. I never stopped looking. I never stopped loving you." Slowly, carefully, Emily uncurled. She crawled across the mattress on hands and knees, then stopped inches from her mother. "Is it really you?" Grace opened her arms, crying now. "Yes, sweet girl, it's me." Emily collapsed into her embrace, small arms wrapping around Grace's neck, as though her life depended on it. In many ways it had. The room around them disappeared. No police, no equipment. Just mother and daughter finally reunited after 2 years of silence, shadows, and stolen time. Later that day, Emily was taken to the hospital under careful supervision. Grace never left her side. Doctors said she was severely underweight, dehydrated, and had early signs of muscle atrophy, but there were no signs of long-term physical abuse. Whoever had kept her there had kept her alive. Detective Rowan walked into the waiting room, his notepad in hand. "We got a forensics team analyzing the space," he said. There were fingerprints and surveillance equipment, hidden cameras. Most were turned off, but a few were still active, wired to a local hard drive. Grace's face twisted in disbelief. He was watching her. Rowan nodded, and feeding her. According to Emily, she was given food through a small hatch. She said she wasn't allowed to speak, just read or sleep. If she cried too loudly. He turned off the light. Grace shook her head, horrified. She lived like that for 2 years. She also remembered his shoes, Rowan added. She said they squeaked, and he always whistled the same song. Grace froze, whistling. She remembered now. A soft, constant whistle she used to hear on rainy days. From the garage, from the yard. She never thought anything of it. Until now. Her voice came out in a whisper. "David Hale." Rowan looked up sharply. "Who is that?" "He was a friend. My late husband's friend. Used to fix things around the house. He knew the layout. He built Emily's bookshelf." Rowan scribbled the name. "He's not in the system, but we'll find him." Grace clenched her fists. "Don't let him disappear." That night, Emily slept in a real bed, fresh sheets, soft pillows, a nightlight of her choosing. But Grace sat awake, watching her chest rise and fall. She'd found her daughter. That should have been enough, but it wasn't, because someone had stolen 2 years from them, and Grace wouldn't rest until he paid for every second. Part 4. The room was filled with sterile hospital light and the rhythmic beeping of machines, but none of that mattered after Emily whispered the words, "He said you left me, Mommy," but I didn't believe him. Grace stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, time itself seemed to halt along with her heartbeat. Emily, her daughter who had been missing for nearly 2 years, was here, alive, weak but breathing. And with that single sentence, everything Grace thought she knew about those missing years was turned inside out. Detective Rowan gave the doctor space to check Emily's vitals, then gestured for Grace to follow him out into the corridor. His face, usually a composed mask of professionalism, now showed something else: disturbed focus. "We've identified the man who took her," he said gravely. Grace blinked. "Who, David Hale?" The name meant little at first until a sudden chill passed down her spine. The carpenter, Rowan nodded. 62 years old. Retired. Lives in the basement flat right next to yours. He was contracted by you about 2 years ago to do repairs, your staircase, some attic insulation. She remembered him now. Quiet, unassuming, polite to a fault. Always early. Always left on time. She had offered him coffee once, and he'd declined with a sad smile. He seemed harmless, Grace said faintly. That's often how they seem, Rowan replied. But his background tells a different story. He handed her a thin folder. Inside were photos, images of home-set salesmen, tools of small notebooks, and the unsealed access plans that had led the teams in Grace's basement straight into a hidden crawl space connected to David Rose's. After finding Emily behind that false wall, we noticed air movement. That's how we uncovered the vent that runs into Hale's property, Rowan explained. He used a maintenance passage from the 1950s design. The access was hidden behind your water heater. Grace's skin went cold. He was under my house the whole time. Yes, he knew your routine, your night shifts, your daughter's bedtime, even where you kept the spare key. He planned this with extreme patience, and we believe it started long before Emily disappeared. Rowan pulled out a faded blue notebook, its corners frayed from handling. He opened it to a page dated just weeks before Emily vanished. Saw her again today. Blonde hair quiet, always reading. No laughter. House too empty. Mother's car gone again. Left alone too often. She needs someone. I see her. A sharp sting spread through Grace's chest. She couldn't breathe for a moment. He thought I didn't love her, she whispered. He convinced himself that you weren't present enough, that she was emotionally abandoned. In his deluded mind, he believed he was rescuing her. Grace shook her head violently. That's not rescue. That's abduction. Absolutely, Rowan said firmly. But in his fractured world, he became her savior. His own wife and daughter were killed in a drunk driving accident 6 years ago. He never recovered. From what we can tell, he began to reconstruct an emotional substitute, a twisted family in the shadows. The search of Hale's apartment revealed far more than just a disturbed mind. Behind a tall bookshelf was a trapdoor covered with carpeting. Beneath it lay a narrow crawl space outfitted with wooden beams and insulation panels, all leading to the secret room where Emily had been kept. But more disturbing was what they found beyond that room, a second chamber still under construction. A half-built bed frame, paint samples labeled sunflower yellow and meadow blue, a new set of children's books stacked neatly in a plastic bin. He was preparing for another child. Grace nearly collapsed when she saw the photos. This wasn't random, she said, voice cracking. He was planning something bigger. Rowan nodded solemnly. We suspect he intended to build an entire false world. One where he played the parent, the protector, the teacher, where he could rewrite his past. By erasing mine, Grace said bitterly. That night, they combed through Hale's old videotapes and audio logs, hundreds of hours recorded on outdated devices. He documented Emily's daily schedule meals, reading Time, Quiet Time. In his voiceovers, he used affectionate tones. He praised her for being brave when she didn't cry. He rewarded her with extra story time when she didn't ask for her mother. And every single day, he repeated the same lines. You're safe here. The world can't hurt you now. Mothers leave. I won't. This is home. I am your real family. Grace sat in the police station's interview room, listening to one of those recordings. Her fists clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. He brainwashed her, she whispered. He indoctrinated her, Rowan corrected. But your daughter didn't fall for it. That's why she wrote the message on the wall. That's why she waited for someone to hear her tapping. She held on. Yes, Rowan said. To you. The hunt for Hale intensified. Interpol issued a red notice. His passport had expired. His bank accounts were untouched. He had abandoned his flat 2 days before the discovery, leaving only a handwritten note hidden under a floorboard. She is strong now. She no longer needs me. Grace read it 3 times before tearing it in half. You think he'll come back? She asked. He might, Rowan said. Men like him don't believe they've done anything wrong. They circled back to the fantasy. Grace looked toward the hospital wing where Emily was sleeping behind a thick pane of glass and 2 security guards. Let him come, she said. I'll be ready. Days passed. Emily began to speak again. At first, simple things, the colors she liked, the books she remembered. But soon she began recalling the small acts of resistance, how she whispered her mother's name before bed, how she hid paper scraps under her mattress, how she counted the seconds between footsteps outside her wall. He didn't let me cry, she told her therapist. Said it meant I was still weak, but I cried anyway, in my head. Grace wept silently in the hallway outside. She had feared for so long that her daughter would return broken beyond repair. But Emily was not broken. She had endured. She had found her own way to survive, and now the world would know what had been taken from her and who had taken it. Part 5. 3 months had passed since the day they tore down the wall and found Emily alive behind it. The town of Westwood, once known for its sleepy charm and overgrown gardens, had become the center of national outrage. A child had vanished and lived in a hidden room, while her captor lived next door, smiling at the neighbors offering to fix their fences. But now justice had a name: the People versus David Hale. He was arrested without incident in a town 50 miles north, hiding in an abandoned trailer near a wildlife reserve. A worn copy of Peter Pan lay beside his sleeping bag. He told the arresting officers, "I was just waiting until she called for me again." At his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty to kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, and psychological abuse. He believes he saved her. Detective Rowan muttered under his breath as they left the courthouse. He still believes it. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Journalists lined the back row. Grace sat in the front, Emily beside her, flanked by 2 therapists. Her small hand gripped her mother's tightly, her brown eyes scanning the man at the defense table. He looked older, paler, but calm. David Hale didn't flinch when the judge entered, nor when the charges were read aloud. He looked straight ahead, hands folded, a ghost in human skin. The prosecutor, Karen Mendoza, didn't waste time. "This case," she said, turning to the jury, "is not about vengeance. It's about truth. It's about a man who took a child, held her for 2 years, and told her the world outside no longer wanted her, who built a prison and called it a sanctuary, and who, despite what he believes, destroyed lives." Then came the evidence. Diagrams of the hidden room, audio recordings of David narrating Emily's daily life, photos of the trap door, the tunnel, the notebook where he tracked Grace's every movement for 6 months before the abduction. The jury sat in stunned silence when one recording was played aloud. "She cried again today, asked for her mother. I told her the truth. She's moved on, sweetheart. She's busy now. It's hard for her to accept, but she'll see. In time, she'll understand." Grace closed her eyes. Her fingernails dug into her palms. On the 4th day, Grace took the stand. She stood tall, dressed simply in navy blue, her voice clear but trembling as she recalled the night Emily disappeared. How she blamed herself. How she searched every alley, every street corner. How she lost sleep for 700 nights. But it was her final statement that brought the room to a hush. "I used to say I wanted him punished," she said. "Now I just want the truth named. I want my daughter to know she was never abandoned. Not by me, not by the world. And I want the man who stole her to finally see this wasn't love. It was control. It was cowardice." David never looked up. The defense brought their strategy on the 6th day: insanity. They argued that David Hale had suffered a psychological break after losing his family, that he believed he was saving Emily, that he created a delusional world where he could reparent a child and avoid his own grief. "Mr. Hale saw a child who to his mind was unloved, isolated, neglected," said his attorney. "He did not intend to harm her. He believed he was building something better." It was a dangerous argument, sympathetic even, and it worked on some, until Emily testified. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she sat in the witness chair. "He said I wasn't allowed to cry," she told the courtroom. "Said it meant I didn't trust him." The entire room leaned in. "He made me eat the same thing every day. I couldn't ask questions. I wasn't allowed to ask about the stars or Christmas or if mommy was okay. He said people outside were liars. He said he loved me, but love doesn't feel like that." She turned her head. For the first time, she looked at David. "Love doesn't hide you." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the judge had to clear his throat before calling for a recess. But the most shocking moment of the trial came later on day 10, when Detective Rowan returned to the stand. He presented new evidence: a second journal found in Hale's storage locker. Inside were names, addresses, surveillance photos of other families, circled dates, a new girl's name underlined in red. "She was planning her 8th birthday," Rowan said grimly. He'd circled it. The room gasped. He hadn't stopped with Emily. He was preparing for more. The prosecutor closed her case with steel in her voice. "This man is not broken," she said. "He is dangerous. He built a world where he controlled everything, including what a child was allowed to feel. And if we hadn't found Emily, he would have done it again." After 15 days, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts. David Hale was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. No reaction, not a blink. Emily watched the verdict being read. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply reached for her mother's hand and held it tightly. Outside the courtroom, Grace stood before the cameras. This time she didn't speak as a victim. She spoke as a mother. "We didn't win today," she said. "We just stopped it from happening again." Months later, Grace and Emily returned home. The hidden room had been demolished. A new wall stood where the nightmare once lived, painted yellow, filled with light. The window was kept open always. Emily started drawing again. One day, Grace found a crayon sketch on the fridge, a small girl standing beside a tall woman under a sky full of stars. Written beneath it in careful letters was, "Love means letting me see the stars." Part 6. The courtroom was gone. The headlines had faded. But justice, as it turned out, wasn't a finish line. It was only the end of one tunnel leading to a much darker one still. Emily's case triggered a full-scale review of dozens of missing child reports from the past 15 years. Investigators digging through David Hale's past uncovered more than just the hidden crawl space in Grace's basement. They found blueprints, not architectural, but psychological, journals, files, letters unsent, and a disturbing digital archive stored on an encrypted external drive, surveillance footage, photos of children taken in playgrounds, at bus stops, outside school gates. All dated, all cataloged. It was the blueprint of a man who had once planned to rebuild a family from fragments not his. Detective Rowan and his team spent weeks reconstructing Hale's timeline. He had moved to Westwood 5 years before Emily disappeared under a false address registered in his brother's name. His work as a carpenter gave him access basements, attics, quiet corners no one thought twice about. And he always chose families where a mother worked nights or where routines left children home alone, even for an hour. He didn't choose randomly, Rowan told the task force. He studied, he waited, and when he thought he saw a crack, he slipped through it. The media dubbed him the Father Maker. Grace hated the name. "Don't give him that power," she snapped in an interview. "He didn't make anything. He stole." Inside the federal prison in Riverwood, David Hale sat in a soundproof interview room facing a camera. He had agreed finally to make a formal confession, not to the police, not to the court, but to Emily. A recorded statement supervised by the Department of Justice. "I know what I did," he began, voice calm, thin. "I know what you all call me, monster, kidnapper, sick. But you need to understand, I didn't do this out of cruelty. I did it because I saw the hole in her life and wanted to fill it." He looked into the lens with eyes that seemed too clear, too convinced. "She reminded me of Lily, my daughter. The same eyes, the same quiet sadness. And her mother," he paused, then softened his voice. She didn't even notice how often Emily was left alone. "I noticed." He went on for over an hour, explaining, justifying, rewriting. "I gave her structure. I gave her love. I read to her. I made her meals. She wasn't afraid. She was safe. When asked about the locked door, the lack of sunlight, the forbidden questions, he dismissed them as necessary. 'The world hurts children,' he said flatly. 'I created one that didn't.'" Grace watched the video with Rowan and a trauma specialist. Halfway through, she turned it off. "He still thinks he's the hero," she whispered. "No," Rowan said. "He thinks he's the author." At the sentencing review hearing, Emily wasn't required to attend, but she asked to. Now 10 years old, she sat quietly in the same courtroom that had once felt like a battlefield. This time her legs reached the floor. Her grip on Grace's hand was firm. David Hale was wheeled into the room. His health had deteriorated, thin hair, frail body, but his presence still made every breath catch. He didn't look at Emily, not once. The judge read aloud the findings of the psychological panel. Hale was competent at the time of the abduction. His actions were premeditated. He was driven by delusion, yes, but not detached from reality. He knew what he was doing was illegal. He simply didn't care. Before the final sentence was reaffirmed, the judge offered Hale one chance to speak. He rose slowly, gripping the edges of the podium. "I would do it again," he said. Gasps filled the room. I would, not for power, not for revenge, but because the world outside those walls didn't love her the way she deserved. I tried to. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge leaned forward, voice like steel. You didn't love her. You imprisoned her, and for that you will die behind bars. Life without parole, no appeal. The gavel fell, and for the first time in years, Grace exhaled. After the hearing, the world expected Emily to vanish from the public eye, but she didn't. She released a statement through a child trauma foundation that had been supporting her therapy. He built a prison and called it love. But love doesn't need locks. He thought I was alone, but I never was. My mother never stopped searching, and now I'm going to live free for every child who still can't. Her words were printed in magazines, spoken on talk shows, quoted in forums. But none of that mattered to Grace. What mattered was the moment she came home from work a week later and found Emily sitting in the garden, sketching a giant tree with a door in its trunk and stars all around it. Is that the tree from the dream you told me about? Grace asked. Emily looked up, smiling. No, this is the tree I'll build someday. A place kids can come to feel safe. Really safe, not locked safe. Grace knelt beside her. We'll build it together. But the ghost didn't disappear overnight. There were still nights Emily would wake in silence, curled in a ball, and say, he's knocking again. Still at times she'd freeze at the sound of Tim's breathing, or flinch at the hallway lights flickering. But each time Grace was there, to hold her, to remind her she doesn't like you so long. In therapy, Emily began to explore what control really meant. She painted, she danced, she told jokes, and she asked questions, bold sometimes, painful ones. Why didn't I scream louder? Why didn't he take someone else? Would it have been better if he'd never been caught to all of them? Grace had only one answer. You were a child. It was never your fault, and it was always better that the truth came out. The town of Westwood, once complicit in its silence, began to change too. The abandoned property next to Grace's house, Hale's former basement flat, was bought by a local community initiative and transformed into a youth resource center. Emily was invited to paint a mural on the outer wall. She chose a broken wall split wide open with light pouring through, and the words, "Even the quietest voice can break through stone," and beneath it in small cursive, E.B. Emily Bennett. Life like healing isn't linear. There were still cracks, still bruises, but there was also laughter again, a garden, books, and a new dog named Peter because Emily insisted on taking the story back. And at the end of summer, when the fireflies came out and the sky turned soft with lavender, Emily sat by the porch with her sketchbook. On a clean white page, she wrote, I am not what he took. I am what I survived. And above that sentence, she began to draw a lighthouse. Because sometimes the brightest things come from people who've spent the most time in the dark. Part 7. The courtroom lights had long dimmed. The verdict was in. David Hale was sentenced to 28 years in a secure psychiatric facility, not a prison, but not freedom either. It was a place designed for those whose minds, though fractured, had inflicted undeniable harm. For Grace, justice didn't feel triumphant. No sentence could give her back those 2 stolen years. But it gave her and Emily something just as crucial a beginning. And for Emily, it marked the end of captivity and the start of becoming someone new. Spring came early that year. The Ashfield house, once a tomb of unanswered questions, began to feel like home again. The windows were no longer drawn. The locks were changed. The air felt lighter, as if sorrow itself had exhaled and let go. Emily didn't rush back to public school. She stayed home, learning through quiet mornings and long afternoons, filled with watercolor paintings, audiobooks, and therapy sessions that didn't feel like therapy. Slowly, she rediscovered how to be a kid again, even if a few birthdays had been lost in the dark. Each evening, Grace read aloud from their favorite books, at first fairy tales, then poetry, and finally pieces of nonfiction that helped Emily see that her story wasn't the only one with sharp turns and tender endings. One night while they sat by the window, Emily asked, "Do you think I'll always feel broken?" Grace looked at her daughter, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and said, "No, I think you're still growing, cracks and all." Months passed, and one afternoon at the park, Emily saw a little girl, maybe 4 years old, crying on a bench, looking around anxiously. Her mother was nowhere in sight. Emily didn't run over right away. She watched for a moment, heart tight. "That's what I must have looked like," she whispered. Grace followed her gaze. "Do you want to help her?" Emily nodded. That small decision was the first time Emily chose not just to survive, but to protect someone else. And that changed everything. Years later, she joined a youth trauma recovery group, not as a patient, but as a peer mentor. She didn't talk about the room or David Hale unless someone asked. Instead, she focused on rebuilding trust, on laughter, on letting silence be safe again. At one school event, a nervous boy asked, "Did you forgive him?" Emily paused. "I forgave myself first. That part of me that believed no one was coming. Once I did that, forgiving him wasn't as important anymore." Her voice didn't shake. She wasn't trying to be brave. She simply was. At age 21, Emily and Grace sat in the backyard garden, the lavender bushes in full bloom. They sipped tea under the soft golden light of early evening. "Do you ever wish for anything anymore?" Grace asked. Emily smiled. "No, I think I'm already living it." She wasn't referring to perfection. Life still had shadows and healing came in waves, but she had found peace. And in her peace, she created something new, a small wellness center called The Haven. It wasn't flashy or crowded, just a place where other kids, teens, and even adults could come sit in a circle plant, something paint, cry if they needed to, and know they were seen. One day, Emily received a letter from a girl in the program. It read, "I used to think I was ruined, but then I saw a video of you talking about how we don't have to be perfect to be loved. I'm planting a tree today not to hide under, but to grow with. Thank you for being the proof." Emily folded the letter and placed it in her journal. Tears came not from pain, but from knowing her story had become someone else's light. On the 10th anniversary of her return, The Haven held a quiet gathering. No speeches, no reporters, just candlelight and soft music. At the center of the garden, the children had placed a plaque with Emily's initials and the quote she once shared, "We are not defined by what we survived. We're defined by the light we choose to create after." Emily stood in the back, holding Grace's hand. "You did it," Grace whispered. Emily looked around. "No, we did.